Welcome to ServSafe Manager Chapter 7. This is 7th edition. You may notice the format is changed. Now, I did do this for one video, but for the last 3 chapters, it's probably going to look like this. The bulk of the information for passing the test is actually in the earlier chapters, so this stuff's going to be a little more relaxed and chill. I'll still have pictures up and infographics and stuff like that, but a little more relaxed. We're getting towards the back end of the book. There's only 10 chapters. This is chapter 7, so there's only going to be 3 more after this, and they're not crazy long or anything like that. So this one is actually about the flow of food. Holding food for service has a very big risk of time and temperature abuse. We know that people are gross, generally speaking. They sneeze in their hands. They will wipe their nose with their face and then go grab a gas pump. Like, people don't know how to not spread germs. And if you try to give them information on how to not spread germs, they will actively resist it. So it's best practice that anytime food is going to be available for the public, especially if the public are the ones serving, then you're going to want a sneeze guard. People may not like that they have to reach in a certain way in order to get something, but it's a lot better than them getting sick from somebody else's boogers. When you're holding hot food on the line, you want to hold the food at 135 degrees. If it's cold food, 41 or below. You may notice that I said 135 degrees and I said 41 degrees. If you were around for the previous chapters, you would know that that is the temperature danger zone. If you are unfamiliar with what that is and you kind of just stumbled across this video, I have a whole ServSafe playlist. Should be showing up right about now. I recommend starting from chapter 1 because these videos are cumulative. So I'm going to be talking about things assuming that you know the stuff from the previous chapters. If you're holding food in a hot well that has a temp gauge on it, that temp gauge is designed to give you the temperature of the water and not the food inside. So you can't take a pan of whatever, chicken or mac and cheese or whatever you got, and put it in that hot well and assume that because the dial says 150, that the food is being held at that. You still have to temp it out. When you take the temperature of the food, you want to get it as close to the center of the pan. For those that don't know, I'm talking about pans that look kind of like this. So you want to get it as close to the center of that pan as you can, and you want to go about 1 inch deep. If a health inspector comes by, that is exactly how they're going to temp the food. They don't take the probe and put the probe as far down into it as they can and touch the bottom of the pan so they can get a false reading so that they can say that the food is good when it's not. Not that any of you do that, but if you have something like chicken fried steak, you're going to want to check multiple steaks. 3 to 5, somewhere around there. Generally speaking, if you check like 5 of them and they all are at the same temp or above, more than likely they're all going to be at the same temp. If they're not, it is a pretty big fluke. I mean, it happens from time to time, maybe once every other year. Like, it doesn't happen very often. You do want to be a little more diligent with things like bone-in chicken because every single piece of like a chicken leg, for example, those are different thicknesses. So just because one of them got temped out, or even 2 of them when they got pulled out of the oven, there may be one that is not temped out, and that could be the one that gets served to a guest. You actually have an option when you decide to temp food. You can check food every 2 hours or every 4 hours. Now, I highly recommend checking it every 2 hours. And the reason why is because if you temp something, we'll just say mac and cheese for simplicity's sake. Say you made mac and cheese, and you temp it out and the temperature is at 132. Well, because you temped it out at the 2 hour mark, you can now take that mac and cheese back and heat it up and get it up to temp. Usually what we'll do in order to keep the line flowing is we'll bring out a new mac and cheese, put it in its place, then we'll heat the other one up. And then we can either switch it back, or depending on how fast the line is going, we'll run that one out, then we'll go bring the one out that was at the correct temp. Now, if you do it at the 4 hour mark, there's a problem. Say you check the mac and cheese and it is 130 degrees, but you're temping every 4 hours. So the problem that you're running into now is you can't take it back and warm it up according to ServSafe and according to health safety guides. This is why. When you have food that is in the temperature danger zone, between that 135 to 41 mark, you run the risk of foodborne illness every minute that it is in that temperature danger zone. And food can only stay in the temperature danger zone for a maximum of 4 hours. If you temp something before you put it on the line and it temps out, then you temp it 4 hours later and it doesn't temp out, you have no idea if it dropped temp 10 minutes ago or right after you put it on the line. So in a case like this, if you're measuring the temp every 4 hours, now you have to throw the food away. Also, that 4-hour timeline, that's cumulative. So if you have food that was out for 3 hours and you got it up to temp, and then it spends another hour in the temperature danger zone, you can't just keep bringing it up to temp over and over again. Now you have to throw it out. Anyways, something else to remember is never use the holding equipment in order to reheat the food. In our example of the mac and cheese, not temping out, you can't just crank it up to 11 and get it boiling on the line. You got to take it back and reheat it correctly. Do not put it on the stovetop because you'll just burn the crap out of the mac and cheese. Cover it, get it in the oven. If you are serving TCS food, there's going to be some particular guidelines. If you're working with a high-risk population like elderly, children, working in a hospital, anything like that, you absolutely cannot serve TCS food without any temperature controls at all. You have to have temperature controls, and in a situation like that, I said that you only have to check like 2 or 3. If you're working with elderly, check every single one. Like you're just better off checking all of them. If you are working at a place like a hospital or an old folks home and they are serving these people TCS food and they are not using any temperature controls, if you are working for a company and they don't have any temperature controls in place for TCS food, particularly with these high-risk populations, run. There actually are certain situations where you can serve food without any temperature controls. I'm excluding hospitals, old folks' homes, schools, that kind of stuff. Weddings, for example, would be a place where you could do this at. Most of the time, these are going to be in a catering situation where disposables are used. If the food is going to be displayed for a short period of time and there's no electricity, hot food you can display without any temperature controls for a 4-hour window. But then at that 4-hour window, it needs to go away. Cold food is a bit different. Generally speaking, the same rules apply, but with the exception of instead of 4 hours, it's 6 hours. So if you have a salad or something like that, it can stay out being served without any temperature controls in one of these settings for 6 hours before you have to throw it away. The best thing to do with this for hot food or cold food, if you're going to be working under these kind of situations, is the food has to clearly be labeled with what it is and the time it needs to be thrown away. And then obviously, when it hits that time, you got to throw it away. All right, let's talk about a couple other things. Gloves. The general rule is if you are handling ready-to-eat food of any kind, gloves are on. Always, no exceptions. With serving utensils, you can't just have a pair of tongs where they can grab like chicken and then grab the country fried steak and grab the whatever. There has to be separate utensils for each individual thing, and those utensils should be changed out every 4 hours. If you are serving non-TCS food, the utensils can stay outside of the food and you can rest it on like a plate or something. But if it's TCS food, it's got to stay in the pan with the food. If it's ice cream, you can actually take the utensil and put it into water that's at least 135 degrees or hotter, or the water is constantly running. That's why at some places you'll see that they have a scoop and there's like this little tiny faucet that's trickling water in. That's what that is. That's what it's for. One thing that may be a habit to break is if you ever have to handle a guest plate or cup or anything, you can never put your fingers, thumb, or anywhere on any part of the plate that is considered food contact or the glass. So when you're holding a plate, like I have this like random plate of beads. When you're holding a plate, you can't hold, When you're holding a plate, you can't hold it like this. You gotta, You gotta hold it underneath like this. With glasses, you don't want to hold too high up to where it's touching the rim, and never carry the glasses with your fingers in the cups. That should go without saying, but it's in the book, so I gotta say it. Lastly, never touch the business end of utensils, like the part of the knife that's gonna cut, the tines of the fork or the spoons, whatever. You gotta always handle them by the handle. You always handle them by the handle. Take-home containers. Take-home containers are nearly always single use. There are very specific times when they can be reused. I'm going to go over those right now. Now, keep in mind that a lot of these rules are going to vary by state, so you're going to want to check your own local stuff. So this is like, generally speaking, this applies, but there may be a state somewhere that says you can't even use reusable containers. If the container was designed to be reused, like those Stanley cups that came out a while back, those pink ones, those are meant to be reused and refilled. Next, if they were provided by the operation to the guest. So again, those Stanley cups count. They were provided by Starbucks to the people that bought the cups. And lastly, they can be cleaned and sanitized properly. Again, the Stanley cups, if they can survive a car fire, they can be cleaned and sanitized correctly. So Stanley cups would be a good reusable thing. So obviously what this means is this does not apply to things like styrofoam containers and pizza boxes and crap like that. For drink containers, you can never put TCS food in them. I'm not sure why you would want to do that, but again, it's in the book, so there you go. Don't put any chicken smoothies or beef tartare shakes. If they can be effectively cleaned at the operation and at home, so the Stanley cups count for that. And as long as they are rinsed with hot water before they're refilled at the operation, that's how you can refill the glass if somebody comes in and they want a refill. And lastly, the refilling process has to be designed to prevent cross-contamination. Now, as far as tableware goes, it always has to be wrapped unless it is going to be taken away upon the guest being sat. Or if they're going to remain on the table, they have to be cleaned and sanitized as soon as the guest leaves. All right, next let's talk about reserving food. Never do it. Moving on. I don't care how expensive the plate of food is. Never ever do it. If it reaches the table, you're done. I don't care if it's 5 seconds. You cannot reserve that plate of food. I don't care if it is a 10-ounce fillet and a plate of lobster tails. You got to throw it away. You cannot reserve that ever. And I know it sucks, especially from like a business standpoint. It really sucks to watch a perfect plate of food, the most perfect steak you've ever cooked, go straight in the trash. But it's a food safety thing. Even if you could do it, I still wouldn't do it because I would not put it past some of these sick people. There are some sick people out there. I wouldn't put it past one of them to do something horrible to that food before it went out to another table. And not only that, but I as a guest want to know that the food that's being cooked in the kitchen, even as a chef, I want to know that the food that's being cooked in the kitchen is being cooked for me. I don't want to know that it went out to some rando and then came back to the kitchen and then brought back out to me. Like it's just wrong. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. This also includes garnishes, things like free bread, pickles, chips, that kind of stuff. You can't take chips out to a table and then if the table doesn't want them, bring them back and dump them back in the container. Something that may not be so obvious is condiments. A lot of restaurants will try and save money by marrying condiments, taking the open bottles of ketchup and marrying them with other open bottles of ketchup so then they don't have to like throw them away and then get new bottles or whatever. That's actually extremely bad. You can't do that at all. So what type of food can you reserve, you may ask? You didn't ask? Well, too bad. I'm going to tell you anyway. Bottles of ketchup and mustard can be reserved to the guests. They just can't be married, but bottles of ketchup and mustard can be reserved to the guests. You can reserve any prepackaged food that has gone out to a guest. This mostly applies to portion condiments, also called PCs. You can also do this with bottles of ketchup and mustard. That's why a lot of restaurants will have the bottles on the table. It's because they can be reserved. But you can't marry two open bottles of ketchup together. You have to use the same one and then replace it. As long as the lid is closed in between uses, you're good to go. With self-service, I talked about sneeze guard. The same temperature danger zone thing applies. Food has to be clearly labeled. Ideally, you also want to have any allergens that might be on there. You want to have those listed where they can be easily spotted. Every buffet should have only ready-to-eat foods available. But chef, you may say, I go to Mongolian Grill all the time, and I always get raw beef. And I also go to oyster bars, and those are raw too. Well, guess what? You're right, because there's different rules that apply. Oyster bars and sushi bars can put out raw ingredients. Sushi fish is not just regular fish. It actually has a process that it goes through, including freezing the fish in order to make sure the parasites are dead. This is why when you make sushi, you can't just go to Walmart and just pick up random salmon from Walmart because you don't know if it has parasites or not. It needs to be cooked. Sushi grade has gone through this process to make sure it's safe to eat. And Mongolian grills can put out TCS food because guess what? You're not taking that TCS food, putting it on your plate, walking over to your table and eating it unless you're a weirdo. You put that stuff on your plate or in your bowl and you take it over to the Mongolian grill and then they cook it for you right away. So that's how they're allowed to do that. And that beef is also kept at specific temperatures. In either case, whether you are at a buffet, any buffet, a banquet service, or at self-serve, you're not allowed to refill your dirty plate. You got to get a new plate every time. This is a contamination hazard. We don't know, you're going to bring your plate over to the buffet and things can fall in it. And you can also, the longer that you have your plate, the higher the chances for bacteria to be growing on that plate and for you to get sick. And then the restaurant gets blamed because you're using a dirty plate every single time for all your food. Norovirus in particular can easily transfer onto plates and utensils when they're dirty. Briefly, I got to talk about some other things. Bulk food. In general, bulk food must be clearly labeled. There are some conditions that it may meet which will exempt it from having to be clearly labeled. If the product makes no claim regarding health or nutrient content, there are no laws requiring labeling. The food is manufactured or prepared on site. And if it is prepared off-site, it's made by the plant or operation owned by the same person. Regarding catering, catering can have a lot of challenges for heat loss. If somebody is ordering a bunch of mid-rare steaks or medium steaks and you don't have the means to cook them on-site and you have to cook them in the commissary and drive them somewhere, what you'll usually end up doing is cooking them to like 120 or whatever, and then storing them and driving them over, and then the cooking process will kind of finish in the warmer. They'll be ready for service, but the timing has to be absolutely perfect. Catering can create even more challenges, specifically around heat loss. You can mitigate this by using food-grade insulated containers. They kind of look like this. You'll want to label the food with exactly what it is, as well as specific reheating instructions. You're going to want to put the date and time there as well. You want to keep your delivery vehicles clean, especially if you spill something, because that could just end up as a nightmare. If nothing else, it's disgusting and it smells bad. You will regularly want to check the food temps to make sure that you aren't losing temp and it isn't falling too far under. The thing to remember though is if you're going to be opening these insulated containers, every time you do it, there's going to be a little bit of heat loss. So you want to learn the equipment well so you don't have to do that quite as often. You can always temp it when you pull it out and get it on the line. And just straight up, don't accept catering events that are too far away. I mean, that will be the number one thing that's going to kill your food temps. And it makes you look bad because you might have perfect food, but by the time you drive there, maybe that food's not going to look so perfect. And they're just going to blame it on you. They're not going to care that, the food looked good 2.5 hours ago, But that's, whatever. You'll also want to get good at trying to make sure the food is finished as close to the departure time as possible. Like, you want to be putting that stuff in there like maybe within 10 minutes before you're supposed to leave. You don't want to have everything cooked and just sitting in a Canberra waiting to go. You need to leave at 11:30. You want the last thing going in at like 11:20. I'm not sure how many of you are going to be messing with vending machines, but vending machines are not any different than anything else. You need to check the food every single day. You have to still follow time and temperature guidelines, and you need to wash and wrap any edible food before putting it in the vending. And obviously, you're going to want to store trash away from other food, especially TCS. So now reaching the end of Chapter 7, study questions are down below, but you can kind of see why the format's changing a little bit. There is a lot less of the big six is something that really needs drilled in because it shows up constantly. Some of this other stuff are a little more minor. And the test questions for these last 3 chapters are usually a little more nuanced, and they don't show up quite as often on the test. Study questions are down below in the description, as always at the end of every chapter. If you found value in this, let me know by leaving a like, sharing this with somebody else that may be struggling or wants to pass their ServSafe manager. And if you're new to cooking in general, I have a whole host of videos. I'm close to the 200 video mark on things ranging from anything that you could think of in the food service industry. And if you have questions on anything else at all, regardless of whether it's ServSafe or just with restaurants in general, back of house or anything like that, let me know down in the comments. But otherwise, I will catch you in Chapter 8.